If you're in that weird overlap of people who like recording stuff for the internet and people who like weird and experimental concept for games, like I am, there's one game that's probably always stumped you, and that's WarioWare Twisted. Emulating this game has always been a nightmare as is, due to the fact that it originally came with a gyroscope built into the cartridge. Really, emulating any game that heavily focuses on motion controls is always a bit touchy, but especially so for WarioWare Twisted, since the motion controls rely so heavily on being a handheld game. You know, you tilt the screen with the game, it's made for that. So, what exactly is the best way to record WarioWare Twisted? I recently got myself a physical copy of the game, and I wanted to test out all of my available recording methods to see which would be the best for something like a speedrun or a stream. There's 3 criteria I want to focus on for this experiment. 1. How's the presentation? This is the obvious question to ask. Is the game screen clear and easy to see? Is it easy to keep in frame? Is the sound clear and listenable? How well does it play? This is the less obvious thing to consider, but as I mentioned in the intro paragraph, WarioWare Twisted heavily relies on being in a handheld form factor. That's why it was made for the Game Boy Advance in the first place. So we want to make sure that the capture method is keeping in the spirit of the game's original intent. How accessible is the capture method? Or to ask it another way, how easy is it to record this way? Does it require shelling out any kind of money from some external device? Or is it something as simple as pointing a camera at the game screen? Which leads us into our first method of capture. This is the most obvious answer. How do you record a game? Point a damn camera at it! But this has a little more nuance than that. I'm somewhat of a collector of Game Boy stuff, and I have all 3 main revisions of the Game Boy Advance. I wanted to test out this method with all 3 and see which one turned out the best. And also, I find that pointing a webcam at a screen to try to capture it is really charming and gives a lot of characters to videos. I think it's kinda lame how most people just dismiss this as being the worst way to record something. I think it has merit. But with that said, let's go ahead and try out the first model. The original Game Boy Advance is probably my favorite model of the 3 revisions. Sure, the lack of a backlight is pretty monstrous, but I think the form factor is the most comfortable of the 3. Maybe it's just because of what I grew up with, but I've gotten pretty used to the screen. And speaking of which, that's the main problem with this method. Getting the proper lighting for this is pretty difficult, though it's definitely doable with the right angle. The audio is pretty clear, all things considered. I'm sure you could just plug an auxiliary cable into the headphone jack on the Game Boy Advance, then plug it into the line-in port on your computer, and just capture the audio directly into OBS that way. So it's possible to make this better than the setup that I had. Not to mention, this is probably the best way to play the game on a pure gameplay level. I just find the horizontal layout of the original Game Boy Advance to work perfect for Twisted. And of course, the accessibility is off the charts. If you have a camera, you can do this, no problem. A lot of people really like the SP, and I never really got it. I know, it's the worst take on the planet, but hear me out. I just don't like how damn small this thing is. The controls feel like they were made for ants, and the shoulder buttons feel like Tic Tacs, as a famous Scott the Woz once said. Now, I don't have the AGS 101, the SP with the fancy screen, but honestly, that might be to this experiment's benefit, as we'll see in a second. The front-lit screen of the AGS 001 works perfectly for the webcam method. The screen is well lit and easy to see without the glare of the original GBA. Unlike the original GBA though, it's much harder to keep this one in frame due to the long vertical layout of this thing, as well as the center of rotation being around the controls instead of the screen itself. I found myself flinging the screen out of frame constantly, which was a little frustrating to say the least. The screen not being the center of rotation also kind of messed up my gameplay for the same reason. The sound quality while using the SP speaker was about on par with the original GBA, though the lack of a headphone jack removes the option of doing the line-in method I mentioned before. And no, I don't have one of those adapters, because I just haven't gotten around to getting one of those yet. In like the 7 years I've owned this thing. Sorry. So you would think this would be the best option, right? It's got the lit up screen like the SP, and the horizontal layout and the headphone jack like the original. Surely this is a recipe for success, right? Well, just take a look at this footage. I don't know if it's an issue with my webcam settings or what, but it's impossible to see this shit. I'm not super knowledgeable on camera stuff, so maybe I need some kind of special lighting or I need to lower the exposure of my camera, but this is easily the worst one by far. The speaker quality is also wicked quiet, though like I said before, the option for the line-in method is always there. Maybe this could work a little bit more tinkering, but my current webcam doesn't seem to have any settings driver I can mess with, so for now this seems like a lost cause. So, unfortunately I can't give this one a real test since I don't have any model of the DS with a GBA slot. At least not one that works. I have this neon green one, but it doesn't start up and the power switch is totally broken. That being said, I'd imagine the original chunky DS with the front lit screen might be a good contender when it's played on the bottom screen, but I can't be certain. Now, if you aren't insane like I am, your first answer to this question was almost certainly the Game Boy player. It's like the Game Boy capture device. I'm sure most of you know what the Game Boy player is, but I like explaining things, so I'm gonna explain it anyways. The Game Boy player was an accessory that you'd plug into one of the extension ports on the bottom of your Gamecube. Then with the help of a specific disc, you'd be able to play Game Boy Advance games on your TV. From there, it's as simple as getting one of those AV to USB capture devices, plugging your Gamecube into that, then plugging that into your computer and you're all set. And in terms of both picture and sound quality, this is the best solution by far. There's just one tiny little itty bitty baby sized problem with this. You know where the gyroscope is located for WarioWare Twisted? Right there, in the cartridge. You know where the cartridge is located for this? In the Gamecube. So to play WarioWare Twisted this way, you gotta grab your Gamecube and start twisting. So while the video output is great, you gotta keep in mind that I'm playing it like this. Not ideal. Not to mention, the screen is no longer moving along with your tilt, so it feels really unnatural to do certain games. I remember back in like 2014 or 15, one of the first Twitch streams I ever tuned into was a guy playing WarioWare Twisted using the Game Boy player and the DDR Mario Mix dance pad as his A button. He struggled hard on Dr. Krygor's boss minigame, and I don't blame him. It's hard to gauge what way you're supposed to be tilting here due to the lack of the screen moving. And on top of all that, the Gamecube is heavy! I forgot just how hefty this guy is, especially with the Game Boy player attached. I also don't have a DDR Mario Mix dance mat, so I gotta tap the A button on my Gamecube controller with my big toe. This setup is truly the monkey's paw of WarioWare Twisted capture setups. It looks and sounds great, but everything else is so botched that it doesn't even feel worth it. Don't even get me started on the accessibility. Have you seen how expensive the startup disc is? If you don't want to do that, you gotta mod your Gamecube so it can run the ISO of the startup disc, or just use Game Boy interface. So yeah, this one isn't ideal. Now, I don't have any way to do this one because I don't have the money to shell out for it right now, but probably the best way to capture WarioWare Twisted on real hardware is with a DS modded for capture. You get the best quality, the best sound, and the form factor of being able to play it handheld. The primary caveat of this one, of course, is the accessibility. Never mind the price, good luck finding anyone who still makes these damn things to begin with. But if you can get your hands on one, this is the best way to do it. Okay, hear me out. I know we were just talking about doing things officially on real hardware, but I think this one is a valid thing to address. The way I first played WarioWare Twisted was on a modded PS Vita using RetroArch, and honestly, it feels perfect. The tilt controls are perfectly emulated, you get the horizontal handheld layout, the emulation only slows down a little bit on 2 specific micro games, and you get retro achievement support. And the best part, if you have a PS Vita 2000, there are scripts that let you plug it into your computer using micro USB and capture it directly with OBS. And you can capture the audio using the line-in method. If you've got a Vita and are perfectly fine with emulating, this is almost certainly the best way to capture the game. Of course, the barrier to entry is having a PS Vita and the knowledge on how to mod it. The Vita has skyrocketed in price pretty recently, so it's kind of a hard find, but if you can get it, then go for it. This one's even more of a hear me out suggestion than the PS Vita one, but still, hear me out. For a long time, mobile phones were like the only way to emulate WarioWare Twisted properly, and if I'm being honest, they don't seem like that bad of a choice. My primary issue with mobile emulators is that I just don't like using a touchscreen D-pad in literally any situation, because the only buttons required for Twisted are A, B to go back sometimes, and R to hold down the menu in place. It actually works a lot better than you'd think it would. There's plenty of screen recorders for Android, and one is even built into Apple phones, I think. There's just a few issues with this method. At least as far as I know, there's no way to plug a phone into a computer and output its video to OBS, so if you want to stream the game this way, you'll have to do it with something that can stream directly from the phone itself. The other issue is that those digital buttons are going to be recorded into the video. The only idea I have to remedy this is to change the layout of the virtual buttons so they're sitting on the black bars outside of the emulation, then crop the black bars out of the video while editing it. It'd be a shoddy solution, but it'd work. The best emulator I found for doing this with was Pizza Boy A Basic, which has loads of options, great emulation, and even retro achievement support. Damn. I'll be honest, I haven't fucked around with mobile emulators in at least 7 years at this point, so I was kinda blown away with how well this turned out. Good work, Pizza Boy. Those are my 5 ideas for methods of capturing WarioWare Twisted. So which one's the best? If you ask me, the best one in terms of visibility, playability, and accessibility is the original GBA on webcam. I know, that's an insane take, but having the screen turn with the tilting of the console appearing on the capture preserves the original intent of the game. With the right camera settings, the picture isn't half bad, and all it takes to do is owning a webcam. If we're talking strictly visuals and not counting emulators, the award goes to the Game Boy player. Sure, it's a hassle to have to tilt your whole ass Gamecube and press the A button with your foot, but anything for quality, I suppose. And while the price of the Game Boy player and disc is pretty steep, it's certainly not as steep as a modded DS, and definitely not as rare. But if you have access to a modded DS, then the Visuals and Gameplay award would go to that. And if you just have to record WarioWare Twisted footage and have nothing but your phone or PS Vita for some reason, then yeah, sure, go for those last 2 options. I guess there really isn't a definitive best way to record WarioWare Twisted that excels in all 3 categories, huh? What an interesting little thing this game is. For my closing thoughts, I will leave you with this. All we can hope for is that someday, in some distant future where Nintendo stops being a shitty company and actually re-releases their legacy stuff in a much better fashion, WarioWare Twisted gets ported to a handheld that can also be plugged into HDMI or something. Until then, I'll keep doing this.